Hey there and welcome back as we set off on our next set of adventures that are brought to you by the crew over at Patreon. For the next several weeks, they're going to be the ones to choose where we go next. This week, we're heading back to a time of minotaurs, griffins, and a pantheon of gods. The island of Crete was home to the Minoan civilization, which helped give inspiration to the Mycenaeans. But before the Minoan civilization actually formed, Crete had a very long history already. Now, we could look at the whole island of Crete itself, but we're only going to focus on one place on the island. And it's a place that even if you don't know the name, you've probably seen photos from it before. That is the site of Knossos. Knossos is home to one of many palaces on the island, but it holds the honor of being the largest. The site of Knossos is surrounded by hopes and myths. Hopes of finding signs of an ancient culture, the myths of the labyrinth, and the palace of King Minos. And in the early 20th century, one man set out to take and discover all of this. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, and in 1900, he started the first excavations. But before we could talk about the palace at Knossos, we first need to take a look at where it all began, and that is right before the Neolithic. The island first shows signs of occupation starting around 6000 BCE, and they began farming around 5700 BCE. Once they started to farm, the Neolithic settlement on the island took off, and in just a mere 1,000 years, which isn't really much when you look at all of human history, they managed to become not only the largest Neolithic settlement on the island of Crete, but in the whole of the Aegean. The Neolithic site of Knossos was built on top of a hill. And they diversified their farming tactics. They chose not only to raise crops, but also to raise cattle. And the Neolithic gave us many things we take for granted today, like farming. But one of the things we don't often think about is how it freed up people to take and explore other avenues of work. It allowed people to start specializing in specific areas of their craft. And it also led to an explosion of arts and crafts because people now had free time on their hands. The clay pottery that they created at the beginning of the Neolithic is considered very rough, but they soon started to excel in creating pottery, and even started to have more of an artistic eye when making it. They continued to create stone tools during this time, and the level of expertise that they used started to take and grow as well. Carved representations of humans start to appear on the island at this time as well. Their houses at this time were made of mud brick. They would leave the mud bricks out in the sun to bake. Once they were hardened, they would lay them on top of a stone foundation, and their houses were made up of several rooms, with the largest room being in the middle and smaller rooms surrounding that. Neolithic Knossos ended around 2800 BCE with the advent of metal tools. This started the Bronze Age, and it was during the Bronze Age that we see the Minoan civilization first appear. Sir Arthur Evans originally broke the Bronze Age down into 3 time periods: the early, the middle, and the late. But modern science and technology has helped us redefine what he wants to find. Through radiocarbon dating and tree ring calibration, we've actually had to move the dates that Evans originally set up. We also created more sub-periods to the periods that we already had. It's going to get really confusing from here, so stick with me. And these sub-periods are called the pre-palatial, which was around 3000 BCE to 2000 or 1900 BCE. The second period is called the proto-palatial, which is around 2000 or 1900 BCE to 1700 BCE. The third period is the Neopalatial, which is around 1700 BCE to either 1470 or 1450 BCE. And the last period is the Post-Palatial, which is around 1470 or 1450 BCE to 1100 BCE. And because nothing is ever simple, as if what I just said was simple, because try saying Post-Palatial 5 times fast, the periods that we just defined are no longer considered valid. Modern archaeologists actually believe we should look at the cultures on Crete in a more complex growth pattern. So if we can't use the time periods we just defined, what are we going to use? Well, I don't want to keep saying proto-palatial, post-palatial, it's a mouthful, and I don't think you want to hear me keep stumbling over it. So we're just going to use what Evans originally set out, with calling the Bronze Age the early, the middle, and the late. There's not much to talk about when it comes to the early period. We don't really know much about it. What we do know comes from the burials that are found around the island, and the burials really don't tell us much, other than for the advances that they were making in their art. The middle period starts around 1900 BCE, and is when we first see the palace being constructed at Knossos. This is the time period that the Minoan civilization is considered to hit its apex. And the palace that I just mentioned may not have only been a place for political power, but it also may have been a place for economic power. It's very possible that they actually stored food there to distribute to the people of Knossos. Now you would think, a place of political power and that stores a large amount of food, there would be defensive walls. Well, no, we actually don't see any defensive walls around the palace itself, but instead the walls of the palace were rather thick, which leads us to believe that those were actually the defensive walls. And it was during this time period on the island they developed their first writing. They developed 2 forms of script, the first being hieroglyphic, which is thought that they got inspiration from the Egyptians. But unlike the Egyptians' hieroglyphs, we've yet to decipher theirs. The second was a linear script called Linear A. It's thought that this actually got inspiration from cuneiform, but unlike cuneiform, we've yet to decipher this one either. They also had a large trade network that stretched across the Mediterranean, and just like any other civilization, they were able to create some goods themselves, but other goods they couldn't, and living on an island made this even more difficult. They would trade in timber, which living on an island doesn't seem like a very good idea. I mean, just look at England. And in return, they would get things like tin, copper, gold, and silver. The palace we've been talking about so far was constructed around 1900 BCE, and then just 200 years later, in 1700 BCE, it was destroyed. We're not exactly certain how it was destroyed. It's possible it was natural disasters or a fire. They soon built the second palace on the ruins of the first palace, and this time they focused on the way the palace looked rather than how thick the walls could be. The palace is built around a main courtyard and was noted by its well-defined masonry. The palace's walls and floors were heavily decorated with frescoes, showing scenes of nature, and the rooms in the palace were large and very roomy. They even had sanitary facilities, you know, for doing your business. And this is where we see myth and reality collide. The myth is the labyrinth of Minos. The reality is the passageways of the palace were long and indirect, and this could have given birth to the myth of the labyrinth. So the site of Knossos was thriving, and nothing bad could happen to them. Now, if you've learned anything through watching the videos I make, or history in general, nothing good lasts forever, especially civilizations. Sometime around 1450 BCE, it all came crashing down for them, and this was a mixture between natural disasters and a group of people called the Mycenaeans. Oh no! The Mycenaean civilization started around 1700 BCE on mainland Greece, and they borrowed a lot of the culture that the Minoans had already created, taking things like the linear A script and creating linear B, which we've actually managed to decipher. But they didn't just take the written language, they also started to adopt the building practices and the religious practices the Minoans used. But they twisted the religious practices, making them more militaristic and stricter. But the Mycenaean rule over Knossos was very short-lived. By 1375 BCE, they abandoned the site after it was destroyed by a fire. But the Mycenaeans didn't fare well either. During the 13th and 12th century BCE, a little event called the Bronze Age collapse occurred. The Bronze Age collapse is still surrounded by many unknowns. We know that civilizations like the Mycenaean fell to it. We also know that there was a loss of writing systems, culture, and just death on a massive scale. Even though we don't know what started the Bronze Age collapse, we have some ideas. We think it might have been due to natural disasters like earthquakes and droughts, which could have led to civil wars, which would have led to the breakdown of trade routes and political systems. And then there was the other factor for the Bronze Age collapse that you may have actually heard of, the Sea People. The natural disasters and civil wars are pretty self-explanatory. So let's focus on the Sea Peoples. We don't really know much about the Sea Peoples. We do have some written accounts from the Egyptians, but all the civilizations that fell to them, we have no written accounts of them, so this makes it hard for us to be able to study them. The writings that we have from the Egyptians comes from the time of Ramses II, Merneptah, and Ramses III, all talking about the Sea Peoples invasion. We do know that in 1178, Ramses III defeated the Sea Peoples. For Ramses III, it started when they sacked the city of Kadesh. They then soon turned to their old ways of coastal raiding that they did during the time of Ramses II. Ramses III managed to defeat the Sea Peoples, but this came at the cost of his royal treasury, which led to tomb builders not being paid, and actually leads to the first recorded strike in human history. It's quite possible that after the defeat of the Sea Peoples, that they just assimilated into the Egyptian culture, because after 1178 BCE, we have no more writings about the Sea Peoples. So let's get back to the site of Knossos. Even though natural disasters and invading forces brought an end to the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations, it didn't mean an end for Knossos. It wasn't until 1900 CE that somebody would set out to take and discover fact from myth. That was Sir Arthur Evans. And along with uncovering the site of Knossos, he uncovered frescoes that showed a sport that the Minoans played, and that 4 guys in our time would play with a different twist, called bull jumping. Evans also managed to prove or disprove the story of the labyrinth. It depends on which way you want to look at it, when he unearthed the palace hallways. And we also have Evans to thank for the name Minoan. He coined the term after the king of Crete, King Minos. And the site of Knossos still has much to teach us about the people that once lived there through its ups and downs. And maybe one day we'll actually be able to decipher linear A and find out even more about the way they lived. But until that day, we can still look at it, look at its frescoes, and marvel at what the people managed to create. I want to thank you all for watching, and I want to thank the crew over at Patreon. Along with helping choose where we get to go next, you also get extra videos like the excavation that we just did last week. Somewhere encased in this is supposed to be a bronze something or other. We will find out together. I don't know, should I just whack it with a hammer? So for as little as $2 Canadian a month, you could become part of the Patreon crew and help choose where we go next and get extra content.